Hi everyone, welcome back for session 4 of Supporting Your Struggling Readers at Home. I'm Natalie.
I'm Kim.
Today we have a little bit of a packed agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the processes that you can use at home to create a program for your children. We're going to look at Fluency and Comprehension, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the Ontario curriculum and also Advocacy. So here we go.
So the first thing that we would like to talk to you about is the scope and sequence of a structured literacy approach to reading instruction. So by scope and sequence, it's simply the order in which you would teach your child and get them through the reading process. So the first the first thing that you would focus on is phonological awareness skills, which we have discussed in the previous sessions. The next is phonemic awareness skills, which is again oral language. It doesn't involve print yet, but it's just the manipulation of sounds in words, single units of sound. The third thing on the scope and sequence is the decoding and blending of sounds. And Natalie and I showed you a few simple activities that you can use at home to practice these decoding and blending sounds, and including using your code pack, using magnets on cookie sheets, and using some blocks. So making sure that you always have that kinesthetic motion or that hands-on activity going with the visual and the auditory. Next is encoding. So decoding is the process of sounding the letters off the page, and encoding is segmenting a word into its individual units of sound. So that is also known as spelling. So when we encode, we are using our knowledge of the sounds of letters, and we are then putting them into print. So from sound to print. Sight words is something that we touched on briefly in session 3. Sight words are some words that are not always decodable, but are necessary for reading and for reading fluently and for comprehension later. And in some different programs, they call those red words. And so those are words that don't always follow the patterns that we had talked about, but they have their own rules and maybe don't always follow the regular rules. And then there's reading fluency, and finally comprehension. So we're going to touch on that later in this session.
Great. So next up, I'm going to share with you some components. Kim, do you want to just give that a hold of a reading program at home? For teachers, this could be part of your lesson plan. So there are various components that we want to make sure we're including when we are working with children who are struggling with reading. And so the first is our visual drill, which is our code pack. So we're going through our graphemes and asking them to share with us the phonemes, the sounds for the letters. And all of these activities aren't long. They're maybe 5 minutes tops for each activity. Could be 10 minutes, but you're not spending hours on each of these activities. They can be done throughout the day. So they can be quick activities that, in the morning while you're having breakfast, maybe you do a quick run through your code pack. And then, a couple hours later, you might go through another activity. They don't necessarily have to be completed in this order, but it would be nice to follow some of this order. So we have our visual drill first. Next up, we have our dictation, which is our auditory. So that would be me or you, the parent, reading a word and the child trying to spell it out. And remember that we're only working with sounds and letters that we've mastered. So I may say the word bat, I may say the word pit, I may say the word bus. And then have the child write the words out. They may identify sounds in it. You may say identify the vowel in the sound, identify the initial consonant, but we're choosing to do a dictation based on the auditory, so what they're hearing. We could work on some blending activities, as we've already given you demonstration of those, both visually and auditory. So blending sounds, segmenting them, or blending the letters, the graphemes, to create words. We will also work on reading words, phrases, sentences, and paragraphs. And this is especially for more, as we get into more advanced skills, you may be starting with words, then branching into phrases, sentences, and then finally paragraphs and stories or books as you proceed along. And ensuring that all of those are decodable. And again, to reiterate, what that means is that the child is able to recognize all the sounds in the text. Next up, you may introduce a new concept at some point. So if you've only been working on single letter sounds, so only consonants and vowels, you may introduce a digraph, which is 2 letters, 1 sound. So 2 graphemes, 1 sound, such as shh. So that may be a new concept that you introduce. And so you introduce that concept that day, and then you work with it, and you spell with it, you listen to it, you write it out. And so then you may do your spelling dictation, your SOS. So that was our simultaneous oral spelling, where we introduced the word. I said the word bat. It was repeated. We segmented the sounds. We named the letters. We wrote it down, and then we read it back to ourselves. And that can be done with our new concept as well. So we may introduce our new concept into that, and we may introduce it into some connected text, our reading and words as well. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're doing some handwriting practice as well. So as always, when we're doing our code packs, especially, we're making sure that we know that our students and children know the proper way to spell and write their letters, their graphemes. And so we want to make sure that we continue to follow up with that, and that we ensure that they are writing clearly and on these straight lines, within the lines, following the patterns of written language. Next up, we are going to take a minute and talk about fluency. So fluency is the ability to read words quickly enough and with accurate phrasing to retain the meaning. So before we get to comprehension, we need to be fluent, because if we are spending too much time decoding and our reading is not fluent, we're going to have a lot more difficulty comprehending. So an example of non-fluent reading would be, if I was reading this, I might be saying sk, o, p, si, qu, et, s. So if we have a student that's reading like that, it's going to be really hard for them by the time they get to the end of sequence to remember that the first word they read was scope. So they may have a lot of difficulty. We really want them to be able to read scope and sequence. As an adult and a proficient reader, I may read scope and sequence very quickly. It's okay if they're not reading quickly. It does need to be fluent. So I'm going to give you a couple ideas of what fluency involves. So fluency involves pace, which is the speed in which we read. So whether we're reading quickly or slowly. So I just gave an example of pace with the reading. We want our children to be reading at a smooth pace that's not too quick. So I don't want to be reading scope and sequence. I don't want to be saying scope and sequence. Scope and sequence. And that's really important. So the goal is to read at just the right pace. Then we have our phrasing. So that's chunking the words together into meaningful phrases. So as an example, Samantha drove to the store and bought some bread. So we can chunk that down into phrases. So we have Samantha drove to the store and bought some bread. So they're not reading the words one at a time. They're not going Samantha drove to the store, and we want them to read it at least in phrases and fully the whole sentence. Next up, we have intonation, which is the feeling in your voice. And this can be a real challenging part for students with dyslexia and struggling readers, because a lot of time the intonation, proficient readers pick this up naturally when they're reading, and we can read ahead to sort of know what's going to happen. And we're already reading the next words before we've even finished speaking the word that we're looking at right now. And so struggling readers have a really hard time reading ahead because they're spending more time decoding and making sure that they're following the patterns and rules of the language. And so expression can be challenging. Often they may miss the exclamation mark or the question at the end of the sentence because they're not looking that far ahead. So they don't know to raise their voice when it's a question. So when we ask a question, I may say, "How are you today?" And my voice raises. Or if I'm excited, I might say, "We had so much fun." And so struggling readers can have difficulty with that because they're spending so much time decoding. And so we want to make sure that we practice with them those skills. And then the last one is punctuation. So we really need to pay special attention to punctuation. We need to make sure that at the end of a sentence, when they see a period, they're taking a pause. When they have a comma, they're pausing. When they see the exclamation mark, the question mark, that they're following all of the forms of punctuation and ensuring that they're reading that sentence fluently. And so some strategies that you can use at home for fluency, the main strategy is that we're going to model and we're going to practice lots and lots and lots and lots. I wish I had more for you, but really that's going to be the most effective way is modeling. So if I'm, for instance, practicing maybe intonation and punctuation, I'm going to do an example. So I'm going to use the sentence, I am sad. So if I'm using I am sad and I want my child to work on intonation, I may, for instance, work with Kim and I may say, Kim, we're going to say the word I am sad. I'm going to stress the first word, which is I. And then I want you to repeat that. So I am sad.
I am sad.
So we would be looking at a text when we're doing this, and Kim would be following along with her finger so that she's making sure she's reading the right words, and I know that she's putting the stress on. And then I may say, now we're going to put the stress on the second word. So I am sad.
I am sad.
And then finally, we would move on to the stress at the last word, which I would say, I am sad.
I am sad.
And so you can work with your child in that way to develop that's to work with their intonation and punctuation. And so it would be the same if we're working on two sentences. I might say, I might have her practice pausing. So I might say, we're going to look at the periods and we're going to make sure we take a really deep breath. So I was just going to say, let's read the sentence. We are happy. Do you see the period at the end? Can you read it?
I am happy.
Now take a deep breath, pause.
I am happy.
Next sentence is I am sad.
I am sad.
Now can you read both of those together and put a pause?
I am happy. I am sad.
And so you would continue to model and practice those skills. Another thing we can do is for fluency, we can work on similar terms. So this is sort of like our word families, but not quite. So I may have a phrase such as the bump. And then what we would do is we would read similar examples. So I may say on the bump.
On the bump.
From the bump.
From the bump.
To the bump.
To the bump.
Then I may have the tent. With the tent.
With the tent.
In a tent.
In a tent.
To the tent.
To the tent.
And so we're mastering the skill we're kind of using the same word at the end, but it's just helping us because we're spending less time decoding because we know that the pattern is there, that at the end we're going to say in a tent or the bump. And so it's helping master those skills. Okay. So fluency, the key is modeling and practice. And when you're reading yourself as a parent, you want to always be modeling these practices. You want to be modeling using the right pace. You want to be modeling using the right phrasing, the right intonation, and the punctuation. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about comprehension. So comprehension is our ultimate goal with reading. This is what we call reading to learn. So we can learn to read or we can read to learn. And when we're reading to learn, we really want to comprehend. And in order to comprehend, we need to make sure that we have all of those other skills, our phonological awareness, our phonemic awareness, our decoding and blending, our encoding skills, our sight words, our fluency, and then finally we can reach comprehension. And so there's a lot of strategies that we can use for comprehension. Much of these are going on in classrooms. Our classrooms are really strong at helping readers with comprehension. We're lacking a little bit with the phonological awareness and the phonemic awareness, as well as the decoding and encoding. However, we're doing really well with our comprehension. And so some strategies that we can use for comprehension are, before we read a text, we would offer a book and we would look at the cover, we would look at the back of the book, and we may read the the review of what's going to happen in the book, and we may make a prediction about what we think is going to happen in this book based on the pictures on the front, based on the title. We could do a variety based on what we read on the back. We may do a picture walk, which we go through the book before we read it, and we just look at the pictures, and the child can create a story based on the pictures. They can guess what's going to happen. They can tell us about the picture and what's going on in the picture. And so we'll do this picture walk to help build a little bit of comprehension. We're going to access our prior knowledge. So we're going to look at the book. We may see a picture of a pig, and we may say, what do you know about pigs? Have you ever seen a pig? Have you ever been to a farm? So we're going to ask them questions to elicit and to find out more about their prior knowledge. And then we may ask a prediction. We may say, what's going to happen in this book? What do you think is going to happen? It looks like the pig falls down. Do you think it's okay? So we're going to ask them a lot of questions. Next up, while we're reading, so we're going to start reading our book. And we are going to clarify meanings as we're going through. So we're going to make sure they understand vocabulary. So if there's a new word that's introduced, we may say, do you know what that word is? Have you heard that before? And you may bring in a dictionary. You may explain it to yourself. You may even have the child go explore themselves what the word is. You may say, let's look that up. And if you have your phone handy, let's look up what that word is and find out what it means. And so we want to make sure that we're clarifying meaning in the vocabulary and in the text. We may read a sentence and say, tell me what happened in that sentence. And then we may read two sentences and say, can you tell me what happened in those two sentences? And as the children progress with comprehension, we may ask them to ask them what happened in the paragraph or at the end, the entire book. But we want to make sure that if they're having difficulty with comprehension, that we're starting really small and then advancing as we go along. We're going to ask them to look for deeper meaning. So we're reading a book and we may say, why do you think that's important? Or what does that mean to you? Or what do you think they meant by this statement? So we're just sort of accessing the information that's in their brain and seeing how they're putting it together and how they're identifying with it and relating it to previous content and previous vocabulary. Lastly, after they've finished reading, we really want to pull that together for them, especially if we're trying to develop their skills as readers. Competent readers will do this naturally, but we may need to teach these skills or reinforce these skills with struggling readers. So this can be done with follow-up activities, and we see this a lot in classrooms. Sometimes they're called culminating activities or final projects. And so that's where, often happens with book studies. A student will read a book and then we give them options for how they can show us what they've learned. And so this can be done through comic, write a comic book based on what you read in your book, create a short film, reenact it, write a new ending, do a character sketch. So there's a lot of different ways that they can show us what they've learned from the book. It doesn't have to be, pen to paper, write a paragraph for me and tell me what you learned. We want to create those multisensory and dynamic activities that are going to keep them engaged and interested. We also want to make it relevant for them. So we want to draw connections to themselves and to the world at large. So how does this fit into your lifestyle? How do you, Sarah, in the book, Sarah fell and broke her leg. Has anything like that ever happened to you before? Can you think of a situation that's similar? They may describe a situation to you and you can ask more questions. So we really want to be with comprehension, asking questions through the whole process, right at the beginning, right to the end. This doesn't have to happen with every book we read, obviously. This is a strategy that we're using to help our readers develop skills. So sometimes we're just reading books and we're taking it in and we're enjoying the book. They may have questions for us, we may have questions for them, but we're not actively engaging in the process of comprehension. But we do want to, at certain points, actively engage in the process of comprehension so that we are teaching and modeling the strategies so that they know when they're reading a book what the purpose is and why they're reading it and what they're going to get out of it. And so that's really important for comprehension, that we are modeling and that we're teaching them how to comprehend. Sometimes that gets forgotten. We teach them all of the stages of reading and then we forget about the comprehending, which is our ultimate purpose for reading. Okay.
And I'm just going to add, many people have probably heard this before, but when it comes to reading comprehension, sometimes in the earlier grades, we are learning to read, or children are learning to read, and then later on, they're reading to learn. So that is why the comprehension piece is so important. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about structured literacy and the Ontario curriculum. So I am an elementary school teacher in Kingston, and I'm also a student support teacher. And many teachers who are learning about the structured literacy approach to reading, and many parents as well, are asking themselves, why do we not see this in all classrooms across Ontario? And the reason is the Ontario language curriculum doesn't explicitly use the vocabulary structured literacy. In fact, the Ontario curriculum has some vague concepts that can include structured literacy, but structured literacy is not an expectation. It is not expected to be taught. However, it can easily be incorporated in the current Ontario curriculum expectations. The teaching and the structured literacy can be incorporated into the Ontario curriculum because the Ontario curriculum advocates and includes teaching approaches that should be informed by the findings of current research. And structured literacy is absolutely a science-based process and would fall under the umbrella of current research. And in fact, the Ontario curriculum documents are not current. So we want to make sure that if we are teaching children the best way to read, that we do include a structured literacy approach to reading. There is an expert panel that is quoted in the Ontario curriculum, and they do advocate that current research practice is used. And so that is why structured literacy can be incorporated into the Ontario curriculum, even though the word structured literacy isn't currently one of the vocabulary or terminologies used. Also, the Ontario curriculum says that phonics instruction should be included in the curriculum, though it doesn't specifically outline a scope and sequence. Most of the expectations in the Ontario curriculum focus on whole language or a balanced literacy approach, which includes expectations such as, does the child make predictions before reading? Does the child ask questions after reading? Is the child using picture cues? Is the child making inferences? And these are all very important aspects of the reading process, but they fall towards the end of the scope and sequence of reading. And so we want to make sure that we include structured literacy in our daily reading programs because it is really a fundamental aspect of reading, and kids need to be able to decode using structured literacy approaches before they can be fluent readers.
I'd like to add a little piece. I've been reading a book called Overcoming Dyslexia. It's very heavy. However, I'd like to read this quote. This is from a doctor from the late 1800s to early 1900s who made recommendations for children with dyslexia. At the time, they called it something different. But here is what he says about recommendations for children with dyslexia. And I'd like to point out that this was from 1904. On my advice, no further attempts were made to teach him in the class, but he was advised to have special reading lessons by himself. The lessons were not to be too long, but were to be repeated frequently during the day at intervals as to refresh and strengthen the visual impressions made in the first lesson. This plan was adopted and succeeded in a degree which surpassed all other expectations. And so when we're talking about current research, we're talking about research that really has been ongoing for over 100 years and that we still have not identified in the Ontario curriculum. So we're seeing that 100 years ago, professionals were aware of dyslexia and ways to support dyslexia, and we're still not seeing a lot of those strategies in the classroom. And that goes along with early intervention, which is very important, and the Ontario curriculum does not address, neither do most school boards. Most school boards ask students to wait until they are in grade 3 for assessing and for diagnosing dyslexia. However, same professional quotes 1904, "It is a matter of the highest importance to recognize as early as possible the true nature of this defect when it is met within a child. It may prevent much waste of valuable time and may save the child from suffering and cruel treatment. When a child manifests great difficulty in learning to read and is unable to keep up in progress with its fellows, the cause is generally assigned to stupidity or laziness, and no systematized method is directed to the training of such a child." And so right here in 1904, they're recognizing that children with dyslexia need a systematic approach to learning how to read. And yet our current curriculum has not addressed this in 2020.
So that brings us to our next point,
Perfectly.
which is currently the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which is the OHRC, has been investigating since last October 2019 school boards across Ontario and investigating the different strategies that they are using to ensure that children's literacy needs are being met. The OHRC says and upholds the fact that it should be a human right to learn to read. And what we're seeing across Ontario is that there are more and more students who are going through the grades and who are unable to decode books on their own. So as they get towards high school, they're not reading to learn, they're still learning to read. So the gap, what we're seeing in the Ontario public school system is that the gap is increasing. And students are finding it to be harder and harder to close the gap. So as they go through the grades, those reading needs are not always being met. So we are coming to you today, and we are coming to you with these workshops because we want to address some of the needs that are being investigated through the OHRC. So as parents and teachers out there, we want to speak to you a little bit about some of the things that you can do to help advocate for some structured literacy in your child's school or in your child's school board. The first important thing that all parents, and I'm sure many of you out there have already done, is to review what your board's policy is for supporting students with special education needs. Now, your child may not be diagnosed with a special education need, may not have any assessments, but may be a struggling reader. So it's really important for you to know what your child has access to and what resources are available for your child. For example, does your school have a student support teacher? In different areas, this could also be called a resource teacher or a special education teacher. Here it's known as the student support teacher, SST, and sometimes it's the SRT, student resource teacher. So it's always very important to make sure you stay connected to your school community, speak to other parents about whether or not their children are struggling with some of the same things that your child's struggling with, and what are the resources and supports that are in place for those students. So we want to ensure that students have equal access. We want to ensure that the supports and strategies that are taking place in the schools are equal and accessible for all students. And we really want you to know that there are resources in the community, such as occupational therapists, speech and language pathologists, clinicians. The clinicians sometimes do what we call psychoed assessments, psychoeducational assessments, but they can also come in and do some observations if you are worried that your child may have learning disability in reading, also known as dyslexia. So it's very important that you stay connected to your child's school and the school community.
One thing to add as well, if you are recognizing that your child has difficulties in reading at an early age, it is crucial that they get assessed as early as possible. Your board is likely to ask you to wait until they are older. Do not wait. Have them assessed as early as possible so that you can get remediation as early as possible, because that is going to be really important for their success in the future.
It's also important that you keep records of the communication, keep records of the conversations you have with the classroom teacher, keep records of the conversations you have with the student support teacher, vice principal, and the principal. Your child If your child has been diagnosed with a reading disability, they have access to a student support team. And it's very important that you continue to have communication and you share what you are seeing at home with your child's student support team. Also, there are so many different acronyms out there. I think I've thrown out 2 already, the SST and IEP and IPRC. It's really important that you ask for clarification. No question is a bad question. Ask, what is an SST? What does my child have access to in terms of supports? A question that I frequently am asked is, will my child get additional supports if they have a psychoeducational assessment and if I have a diagnosis for my child? So those are questions that you want to address with your child's teacher before going to the expense of a private psychoeducational assessment. Also, it's very important that you have some representation in your child's school. Try and form a relationship with the school community. Find out what the culture is when it comes to supporting children's educational needs and be part of that process. We have many parents who like to volunteer in the classroom, and I welcome volunteers in my classroom. It's always an open door policy. Talk to your child's teacher. Say, I have concerns about my child's reading. Can I come in and maybe do some reading groups and work with different students, not just your student, of course. But try and be as involved so that you know what your child's teacher is doing so that you can implement similar strategies at home and create that connection between home, school, and classroom. Creating that triangle of connection can have enormous benefits for your child.
If you can't be in the classroom, you can also speak to your teacher and find out what they're working on in class so that they can send it home and they can give you strategies to work with your child at home.
There are many documents available online to help you become more familiar with the rights that your child has in terms of his or her educational supports. There are some documents that are given by the Ontario government, the Ministry of Education of Ontario, including the IEP document, as well as some documents that speak to you about the IPRC, which is the Identification, Placement, and Review Committee. And know your rights in terms of how often can you revise the IEP and how often does the IPRC committee meet? Can I waive my IPRC meeting? And if so, can I reschedule it for a later time and talk about my child's IPRC placement? Also, it's really important for you to familiarize yourself with the different programs that are offered throughout the school board. Many different school boards offer different programs for children with learning disabilities. And so in order for your child to have access to some of these programs, make sure that you speak to your child's SST, VP, or principal about what needs to be put in place in order for your child to have access to these programs. For your child to be in the learning disabilities program, does your child have to have a diagnosis? Different boards have different programs. So make sure before your child reaches a certain age that you know what your child needs to have in place in order to access some of these resources. Again, we really want to ensure that it's equitable access and that all children are getting their needs met. Because we have limited resources in the school boards, and many people, unfortunately, have to resort to private assessments, psychoeducational assessments, which can be very, very costly. Many people have to resort to private speech and language therapy for their child. Some people may have benefits under their work plans, but many do not. Also, some people resort to private occupational therapy to help their children with their handwriting if it is not explicitly taught in the classroom. And then that hinders the child's written output in later grades when they are expected to write for continuous long periods of time. And so we want to ensure that you are asking the questions that you need to ask your child's school and your child's school board for accessibility to these supports that should be available to everyone. I had mentioned earlier the IEP, the Individual Education Plan, for children who do have a diagnosis, but also children who do not have an official diagnosis of dyslexia. It is important to talk to your child's student support team about getting an individual education plan or an IEP. An IEP outlines specific accommodations and sometimes modifications to the curriculum for your child to ensure that their needs are being met. An IEP is an organic, changing document. So as your child's needs change and as the learning gap hopefully decreases, the IEP will also change along with it. So on the IEP, you would see your child's strengths and your child's areas of need. And the IEP would travel with your child from grade to grade so that teachers can have some consistency in the strategies and accommodations that they are using to meet your child's learning needs. For example, an accommodation may be enlarged print, or an accommodation may be different fidget tools to help keep their hands busy, or body breaks to move around. But it's also incredibly important to advocate on the IEP for support in reading. You can have as many fidget toys as you can fit into a box, and you can have as many different accommodations in place, but at the end of the day, your child needs explicit instruction in reading, and that is through structured literacy. So talk to your child's teacher about including structured literacy on the IEP and asking what reading remediation is being used. And if it's not structured literacy, talk to them about what structured literacy is, and maybe adopting some of those practices at home as well as in the classroom. And
one more note. Often schools will offer Chromebooks or iPads to students that are struggling with reading as a solution. While that can be helpful in the classroom, ultimately students with dyslexia will still need structured literacy intervention. And so please do not accept the iPad or Chromebook as the only remediation that your child receives. They need more. They need that explicit instruction.
And also, when it comes to accommodations such as assistive technology, ask for training. Training is available, and giving a child a Chromebook may just be a further distraction. So ask your child's student support team, is there training that I can access that is available through the board? And there is. So make sure that you advocate for that, because if you don't know it's there, you can't advocate for it. And finally, educate yourself. It's so important for you to know that you are not alone. Your child is not the only child who may be struggling with reading. So there are lots of different resources and websites available online, and many of them are credited organizations. For example, the Ontario International Dyslexia Association of Ontario, the ONBIDA, the International Dyslexic Association of Ontario, as well as Decoding Dyslexia Ontario and Dyslexia Canada. Those are three reputable websites that you can look into to find resources and more information on how you can advocate for your child's learning needs at school.
Finally, there is a wonderful video that you can watch in terms of advocacy. It is called Our Dyslexic Children. It represents a community in the US that advocated for and fought tirelessly for appropriate, effective instruction in classrooms, structured literacy instruction within a specific school board. It is a very touching, very sad film, but also very motivating. So know that you are your child's best advocate. The person that is looking out most for your child is you. That's not to say that teachers are not advocating for your children, that educators are not, but they also have 30 other children in their class, and often many teachers are teaching in many different classrooms. And so you need to be the one to advocate for your child and for their rights and what they are entitled to receive. So with that, we would love to say thank you so much for joining us for these sessions. You should have received, as we mentioned, a resource package with some resources that we spoke to during our sessions. We also have a Facebook page, Lockhart George Literacy, that you can follow us on, and you can reach us via email at Lockhart, LOCKHART, George, GEORGE @gmail.com. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.